All right, you guys, so let's review the Mexican Revolution in more detail and also think about how it connects to the EQs. So, going back to the time of Porfiriato Diaz, so we're going to actually talk about the causes of the revolution before we really get into what actually took place. Before Diaz took power, you don't need to know about the detail of this presidency, but Juarez's presidency was very unstable, and this led to the international community really looking down upon Mexico. Of course, there's still the lingering nationalism that resulted from the U.S. victory in the Mexican-American War, and of course the growing weakness of Mexico within the international community because it had lost so much territory in the Mexican-American War. So nonetheless, there's a lot of political unrest, and this led to a decrease in foreign investment. But then when Porfiriato Diaz is elected president, and he again remains president for over 35 years. So this is in the period in the late 19th century. This is also after the U.S. has recovered from its own civil war. So that initiates an increase of foreign investment in the Mexican economy once Diaz becomes president. So more or less, Diaz's bottom line when he was president was to ensure stability, and he more or less, he was attempting to establish order and progress, in his words, in Mexico. So let's think a little bit more about what reforms Diaz initiated when he was president and the ways in which this affected different classes, because this is going to connect very directly to the push pull factors of migration. So by 1910, and that's the year when the revolution begins, over $1 billion American, and of course that's 1910 dollars, had been invested in Mexican industry, and most specifically, the investments were in oil, agriculture, mining, and ranching. And all these industries are growing in the United States at the same time. So they want to be able to have access to as many resources as possible, which explains the increase in investment, so that they can ultimately have a greater access to resources beyond their borders. Um, the other really important thing to consider is that in the wake of the U.S. Civil War, there's a rapid expansion of railroad construction. So, for example, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, I believe, in 1869, and they're also growing their railroad network between the United States and Mexico. So that means that Mexican foreign trade in general, and this is largely between Mexico and the United States because of railroad construction, expands ninefold between 1877, which was the end of the Reconstruction era in the U.S., and 1910, which is the beginning of the Mexican Revolution. But we have to think about the cons that are associated with this economic growth and the way in which this contributes to some socioeconomic inequality, which is going to be a major push factor for migration. So first of all, one of the things that occurred when there was increased foreign investment in the Mexican economy is that a lot of land was purchased by these foreign investments, of course. And so this breaks up some of the communal farms that existed in Mexico. They were called ejidos. We've talked about them before. You could really compare them to the communes in China that we studied earlier this year. So basically, this means that a lot of foreign investment is just going to snatch up peasant properties, and then one of the major changes that this is going to do to agricultural production is that small farmers are going to increasingly give way to large scale agricultural production, agribusiness as we call it. And this means by around 1910, about 90% of the peasants, and this is more than 80% of the total Mexican population, were completely landless. And they instead are working in what are called haciendas, which are really, really large scale farms that are owned sometimes by foreigners and other times by wealthier people within Mexico. And they more or less are resorted to some of the most subordinate labor conditions that existed in Mexico, furthering the divide between the rich and the poor. As far as how the roots of the Mexican Revolution relate to migration, there are two major effects. There is both internal migration into cities as well as border areas, and much of that again is due to the loss of small farming jobs, as well as external migration or immigration into the United States. And so, what causes this? Well, one of them is that increased foreign investment in Mexican industry is going to lead to uh, a lot of work along the border. Actually, this is a better graphic. I added these graphics from our original slides. Look at especially the concentration of oil and gas right along the U.S. or rather the Texas-Mexico border here. You also, I know it's a little hard to see this graph here, but you see also textiles cropping up in the Juarez area, as well as a lot of other major resources that are located throughout the state. And so the U.S. is going to significantly invest in these industries. So this means that there's going to be an increased demand for labor that even though it's going to change the way in which Mexicans work, it's also having a direct effect on the U.S. economy. And again, there's major immigration or external migration into the U.S. About 60,000 Mexicans were migrating annually to the United States by 1910. And most of the labor demand in the southwest United States was surrounding mining as well as railroad construction. We mentioned in the previous slide that the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. That led to the Bay Area in San Francisco, but there was also a Southwest Pacific or Southern Pacific Railroad completed that led to Los Angeles in the mid 1880s. And you can also see, this isn't crucial, but that the U.S. purchases a little sliver of land called the Gadsden Purchase in order to complete this railroad because this territory was much more difficult for a railroad to pass through. And so the U.S. actually gets another land grab here. It's also important for us to realize that because of this major demand for labor on the U.S. side of the Border Patrol largely ignores and in a lot of ways just tacitly, meaning sort of quietly, encourages illegal crossings because of the demand for labor. So unlike today, the U.S.-Mexico border was very fluid as U.S. investment in the Mexican economy increases and as the American population starts to shift further west. In general, there's just a lot of movement into these areas, both internally and externally. And when I say internally there, I mean people from the United States also moving to these areas. So this population shift all around is going to be a major push factor for migration, rather actually a pull factor, I meant, both to the northern areas of Mexico and to the southwest United States.